Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now last month we took a look at the new Intel ARC B580 and today we're taking a look at its baby brother, the B570. This is a 10GB graphics card. So a little bit about the card. I have the Sparkle Guardian OC edition. I bought the Sparkle B580, really impressed with it. That was a 3-fan design, really quiet, even under load. And I can say the same for the B570. Unfortunately we don't get the little anti-sag bracket that came with the B580. We have the same 8-pin connectivity here, and the little connection protection things, you know, the things that plug into the HDMI display port and all that, came in this separate little bag, which was a nice touch. They're not sure why they weren't plugged in to the connectors, but never mind. Let's get into it. The B570 then. This one seems to be clocked at a max of 2750 MHz as opposed to the B580's 2850. I'm going to be talking through each game today, talking about the performance, discussing what I feel about the performance itself, where I think some improvements could be made, and just generally discussing my initial impressions of this, well, what is to be considered, I guess, a modern budget card. We'll start off then with Cyberpunk 2077. You can see the footage on screen already. We have 84 FPS here at the high settings. Looks good at high. We have the high crowd density as well. I'm actually using the B570 with an i7-12700F, my personal CPU these days. I think it actually works pretty well. Of course, we have to be aware of the CPU overhead situation, and that is basically that this card will perform not as well as it should with less expensive processors. I read an article about it. The 5600 Ryzen, for example, will give worse results than using a higher end Ryzen, and I think the same can be said for Intel CPUs. Not just the standard, what you'd expect, lower performance because of a lower CPU, but there's definitely some sort of utilization issue going on as well. With the i7-12700, this is a chip I paid £150 for second hand. I think it's actually a decent choice, and it seems to be working okay with the ARC, but it should give you some idea of how it works with a CPU that's not top end of the spectrum, and perhaps a better example of what you may end up pairing a card like this with. I'm not quite sure about that power consumption reading. It's recording less than 100 watts a lot of the time, which seems a little inaccurate to me, but performance-wise, the figures seem pretty spot on. I'll have some comparisons towards the end of the video as well to the B580 in a few demanding examples. But before then, let's move on to the Baldur's Gate 3 gameplay here. 1080p, high settings once again with TAA. Taking a walk around the lower city here for 102 frames per second on average. The 1% low recorded at 72 and the 0.1% figure was 44. So all in all, a fairly consistent experience from the ARC card. Once again, our GPU seems to be fully utilised here, running at 2750 MHz and running at less than 60 degrees. I have to say this is really quiet in my system today. I'll probably do a 1440p benchmark video at some point as well, running through a few titles at higher resolution, maybe even pushing it to 4K. There are a few things I'd like to test with the B570, much as I did with the B580 as well. For the Black Myth Wukong benchmark, we have 1080p low, XeSS was enabled, but the resolution scaling was set to 100%, so we're not upscaling from a lower res here. This is full fat 1080p as it were for 72 frames per second. Seems to be running a little better than when I previously tested this with the B580. 6257, that's the latest driver at the time of this video, coming in at about 1.4 gigabytes, so big downloads. The latest driver is the one I'm using, as I always do for these test benchmarks, and things may of course be different if you're watching this at a later time. That said, one game I am still having problems with is Counter-Strike 2. Here at 1080p high with anti-aliasing off because it defaults to MSAA by default, and of course that's a bit of a frame rate hog as it were. We're seeing 232 frames per second. Now this sounds absolutely fine and looks fine on paper, but the 1% low of 111 and the 0.1% low of 15 do indicate a few issues, and that is with consistency. Every so often, and I'm not sure if you can pick it up on the screen, there's a little sort of dip in the frame times. A little, I guess you could call, micro stutter. It threw me off a bit during gameplay. This is a problem that I saw with the B580 as well. I remember Counter-Strike Go used to perform horribly on ARC cards at first when the A750 first came out. So performance has much improved, to be fair. It's it's significantly better than it was on ARC cards with this new game CS2, but I think there is still a little work to be done, and we can see that in terms of GPU utilization, it's a bit all over the place as well, sort of going between 50 and 100%. That could just be impairing with this processor, but I seem to recall this happening with the i9 that I tested with the B580 previously as well. Now, Elden Ring is more of a consistency test than anything because this is capped at 60 FPS by default, and I tend to leave this cap on. Of course, it hits 60 on average with the highest settings at 1080p, and in terms of consistency, it seems to run really well on the ARC card, 56 FPS as that 1% low, and 44 as that 0.1% low, so no issues to report here, and with these settings, I think the game still looks pretty good. I've added a new game to the benchmark roster, Marvel Rivals. Having some fun playing this one actually. High settings, or the high preset. The only thing I changed was the global illumination, which defaulted to lumen, and I turned lumen off because it's a bit of an FPS hog. I don't think the gain in visual quality is worth the FPS sacrifice because visually it doesn't seem to look that much different, and I don't feel it's that important for an online competitive game like this. Nonetheless, at 1080p with high, we saw 87 frames per second, a 1% low of 52, and a 0.1% low of 33. For The Witcher 3 Ultra settings here, this is the next gen version of the game. Of course, TAAU was also enabled for 135 frames per second. In and around the city here, we saw a 1% low of 88 and a 0.1% low of 70, so again, no real issues with this game. I think this may have been one that I had problems with initially with ARC cards years ago, but here it seems to be running absolutely fine. No complaints from me with this one. Next up we have the classic Grand Theft Auto 5. Now of course this has had a few issues with ARC cards in the past, but it only seems to be getting better with time. 1080p, the highest settings and the advanced settings also set to maximum here, along with FXAA returned 109 frames per second. The percentile lows were actually pretty decent as well. Despite seeing the GPU usage all over the place, the performance overall was fairly good. Now I did turn MSAA off because that absolutely destroys our frame rate. I'd expect GTA 5 to run well though because it's fairly old, or so you may think, but as I mentioned, there have been notable problems with ARC GPUs in the past, and I think now it's certainly running a lot smoother than it has been previously. I've thrown The Last of Us Part 1 into the benchmark roster as well because this can be quite demanding at native resolution, and I was curious to see how it ran on an ARC GPU. It's also quite the VRAM hog. At 1080p medium, you can see the game is utilising at least 9 gigs, or 9 gigs plus is being assigned to the game. We're actually using about 6.9, so encroaching on 7 gigs here. If I was using an 8 gig card, I'd be a little bit nervous perhaps. I think medium settings at native is a nice place to be with the ARC B570. And as you can see from the performance metrics, the card is being fully utilised as well when pairing with the i7, 99%. As we move on to Stalker 2, I want to remind you that rebar or resizable bar is of course switched on. That is basically a must for Intel ARC cards. I made a video with the B580 rebar on versus off, just to show you the performance, and in some cases the differences were huge. It was a bit of a mess with rebar off, so I'd recommend using an ARC card with a system that supports rebar. Most systems built within the last half a decade or so should support this feature, but it's worth double checking on your motherboard manufacturer's site whether or not your system is going to support this, as it is a must for ARC cards in order to get the best performance from them. Anyway, in terms of actual performance for Stalker 2, this is the only game I really needed to turn XeSS on for, especially at the settings I wanted to use, medium with XeSS quality. Even at low, we couldn't maintain at least 60 frames per second, so I thought I'd use XeSS quality here, and picture quality looks absolutely fine. To be fair, this is a pretty demanding title, of course. Now we have Red Dead Redemption 2, and you may remember that we had some issues with this one, namely in and around Valentine, whereby the performance would just drop, and we'd see about 30 frames per second just disappear in an instance. I'm not quite sure what that was about. GPU utilization does drop still. The clock speed remains at 2750, and performance does decrease a little bit, but I think it has certainly improved since we last tested Red Dead 2 with an ARC card. Seems to be a bit smoother and consistent with the B570 now and the 6257 drivers. Call of Duty Black Ops 6 up next. At 1080p balanced, we're getting 83 FPS with consistent percentile lows as well, 59 and 45. The gameplay does look a little more stuttery than it is. My capture card decided to play around at this point, so this was actually internal recording from the Xbox game bar built into Windows 10. So the gameplay might look a bit choppier than it actually is, but it was running and it felt really smooth. I thought I'd finalise with a little bit of a ray tracing test. Of course, these new Intel ARC cards do support RT. Here I'm using the RT Ultra preset with XeSS balanced. You're going to need XeSS or another form of upscaling enabled, perhaps FSR, if you want to enable ray tracing and get at least 60 FPS with one of these cards. I was surprised, however, at this result. 69 FPS on average, better than I was expecting. We can definitely tell that upscaling is enabled, but it's still fairly sharp. I wouldn't like to drop any lower than balanced, I'd say, but I don't think we need to here because we're seeing plus 60 FPS. And actually, the percentile lows were fairly consistent as well, 51 and 46. Just look at the VRAM utilization. I think that can be thanked for the smooth performance here. Right, so here we have a few games that I've taken for comparison's sake, tested the B570 and then the B580. Cyberpunk here, 84 FPS compared to 95 for the B580. Baldur's Gate 3, 102 versus 111 for the B580. The percentile lows are also improved as well thus so far. The Last of Us, 67 and 73 for the B570 and B580 respectively. Of course, with a boost in the percentile low as well. And then The Witcher 3, the B570 hit 135 and the B580 hit 149. So both, of course, are playable, but again, the percentile lows are improved with the B580. Now, at the current prices, I do think the B570 is worth it if you want to save some money. Here in the UK, you're looking at £40–50 difference, especially with the current markup on the B580 cards. It seems that both are in stock at the moment. Prices are a little higher than what I'd want to see, especially if you take into consideration the price of 4060s as well, which, of course, is going to trade blows with these cards. It would be nice to see the B570 drop a little lower, 220, something like that. And it would be nice to see the B580 come down in price too. I think if there's like $30 between the two, you might as well just go for the B580 if it's in stock. The extra VRAM is nice to have as well. But the B570 is still a nice choice if you want to save a little bit more cash. And we do have to bear in mind the whole overhead thing in terms of performance, whether or not we'll see fixes with driver updates and how this will affect certain titles. But I wanted to use the 12700F because it's not a really high-end CPU, it's not a completely budget CPU either, somewhere in the middle. And I always try to give you an idea of what you can expect if you're not using the highest end hardware out there. I also had this paired with 32 gigs of DDR4 3200 MHz memory as well, so hopefully this has been helpful. But let me know your thoughts down below. I'll have a few more B570 tests over the weekend hopefully, and hopefully you can join me for those too. But all that's left to say is thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.